Good morning, everybody. This is Denise Tawwab. Today, I will be talking with you about NIST Special Publication 839, and we'll be talking about Step 4 in the risk management process. This is part of a series of videos that cover the 4 steps in the NIST risk management process. Today, we're talking about risk monitoring. What we're going to cover is an overview of the process as outlined by NIST. We're going to talk about risk monitoring, inputs and preconditions to the risk monitoring step, risk monitoring activities, and in this case, there are 2. And then we'll talk about the outputs and post conditions that come from the risk monitoring step. Overview of the process. Each of the steps in the risk management process is described in a structured manner, focusing on your inputs and preconditions that are necessary to initiate the step, the specific tasks that compose the step, and the outputs and post conditions that result from the step. The effects of the risk concepts described in Chapter 2, Tolerance, Trust, and Culture, are also discussed in the context of the risk management process and its multi-tiered approach. Here again, we look at the risk management process applied across the tiers. We have the framing step, assess, respond, and monitor. And if you notice, the arrows go in several different directions, and that is because the process is not iterative, is not linear, it's iterative, and each step informs the other 3 steps. Okay, let's talk about risk monitoring. What is risk monitoring? Risk monitoring provides organizations with the means to verify compliance. That's the first thing. Compliance verification ensures that the businesses have implemented required risk response measures and that information security requirements that are derived from that are derived from and traceable to organizational mission, business functions, federal legislation, directives, regulations, policies, and standards are satisfied. The next thing that risk monitoring does is it determines the ongoing effectiveness of risk response measures. And finally, it identifies risk impacting changes to organizational information systems and to the environments of operations. Analyzing monitoring results. Analyzing your monitoring results gives the organization the ability to maintain awareness of the risk being incurred, highlight the need to revisit other steps in the risk management process, and initiate process improvement activities as needed. Organizations employ risk monitoring tools, techniques, and procedures to ensure risk awareness, helping your senior management develop a better understanding of the ongoing risk to your organization's assets, individuals, other organizations, and the nation. So, monitoring gives your senior leaders visibility into the business's risk posture. Some examples of risk monitoring. Let's start with Tier 1. Tier 1 risk monitoring activities might include ongoing threat assessments. So we've done our risk assessments. We've gone through the process. We've implemented some controls, and our environment is secure based on our risk assessments and the outcome of going through the risk management process. But guess what? It's not a one and done deal. You still have to continue to monitor the environment. And so at Tier 1, somebody is still surveying the landscape for ongoing threats. So we're doing ongoing threat assessments and how changes in the threat space may affect Tier 2 and Tier 3 activities, including your enterprise architecture and your information systems. At Tier 2, the mission business layer, monitoring activities might include analysis of new or current technologies, either in use or being considered for future use by the business, to identify exploitable weaknesses and or deficiencies in those technologies that could affect mission business success. So you're looking at Tier 2, you're looking at the technology that you might be moving toward. Tier 3 system level monitoring activities focus on information systems and might include automated monitoring of standard configuration settings for IT products, vulnerability scanning, and ongoing assessment of security controls. So, the inputs and preconditions to the risk monitoring step. So, from step one, your risk framing step in the risk management process, the inputs that you get include resource constraints associated with establishing and implementing an organization wide monitoring strategy and responses to new threat information. For example, when organizations become aware of an advanced persistent threat reflecting a change in threat assumptions, this may result in a change in the frequency of follow on monitoring activities. So, if we know we're being threatened, we may increase the frequency of our monitoring activities. So, that's your input from the risk framing step. Inputs from your risk assessment step into risk monitoring include risk assessment threshold conditions. For example, the likelihood of threats exploiting vulnerabilities. In turn, organizations should monitor to determine if such threshold conditions are met. If threshold conditions are met, such information could then be used in the risk assessment step, where it could serve as the basis for an incremental or a differential risk assessment, or for an overall reassessment of risk to the organization. From the risk response step, the inputs into the risk monitoring step would be implementation strategies for selected courses of action for risk responses and actual implementation of selected courses of action. Now we get down to the risk response activities, and there are two risk response activities outlined in 800. Task 401 is risk monitoring strategy, and task 42 is actual risk monitoring. Risk monitoring activities. Task 401, risk monitoring strategy. Sorry for that pause. Develop a risk monitoring strategy for the organization that includes the purpose, type, and frequency of monitoring activities. So you have to develop a strategy. What is our purpose? What is the type of monitoring we're going to do? Is it going to be manual, automated, hybrid, and the frequency of our monitoring activities? The purpose of risk monitoring programs directly impact the means used by organizations to conduct the monitoring activities and where monitoring occurs. So, the purpose of your risk monitoring is going to impact how you do it and what you look at. Organizations also determine the type of monitoring to be employed, including approaches that rely on automation or approaches that rely on procedural manual activities that require human intervention. Um, in your risk monitoring strategy, you want to look at value gained versus operational disruptions. Operations determine how often monitoring activities are conducted, balancing, keyword, value gained from frequent monitoring with the potential for operational disruptions due, for example, to interruption in business processes, reduction in operational bandwidth during monitoring, and a shift of resources from operations to monitoring. Monitoring strategies developed at Tier 1 influence and provide direction for similar strategies developed at Tier 2 and Tier 3, including the monitoring activities associated with the risk management framework at the information system level. So remember, the risk management framework outlined in 837 um, handles how you handle things at the information system level, and that includes monitoring. Okay, the types of risk monitoring. There are three we're going to talk about: compliance monitoring, verify that required risk response measures are implemented and that information security requirements um, are being satisfied. And those requirements come from organizational business functions, federal legislation, directives, other regulations, policies, standards, and guidelines. Second type of monitoring, effectiveness monitoring. Determine the ongoing effectiveness of risk response measures after the measures have been implemented. And finally, change monitoring. Identify changes to organizational information systems and the feasibility of the ongoing implementation of risk response measures. So, what's changed? in our information systems? Are they still secure, or do we need to do something else? Task 4.1, risk monitoring strategy. We're going to talk a little further about each type of monitoring. First up, compliance monitoring. The purpose of compliance monitoring, again, is to ensure that organizations are implementing needed risk response measures. Measures. Did I say measures? Failure to implement the risk response measures selected by organizations can result in the organizations continuing to be subject to the identified risk. Another purpose of compliance monitoring is to ensure that the risk response measures selected and implemented in response to risk determinations produced from risk assessments are implemented correctly and operating as intended. And finally, compliance monitoring ensures that risk response measures required by federal mandates or organizational mandates are implemented. So we want to make sure that our risk response measures are implemented. We want to ensure that the measures are implemented correctly and operating as intended. And we want to make sure that they're producing the desired results, and that any measures that are attached to legislation, um, or any kind of measures that are mandated are in place. So let's make sure that the risk responses are measures are in place, but let's make sure the ones that we are legally required to do, or from a regulatory standpoint required to do, let's absolutely make sure those are in place. So that's compliance monitoring. Compliance monitoring is the easiest type of monitoring to perform because they're typically a finite set of risk response measures employed by organizations, and they're usually in the form of security controls. Such measures are typically well defined and articulated as an output from the risk response step. So we know what our regulatory response requirements are. The more challenging part of compliance monitoring is evaluating whether the risk response measures are implemented correctly, and in some instances, continuously. Compliance monitor failures. Compliance monitoring also includes as feasible analysis as to why compliance failed. The reason for compliance failure can range from individuals failing to do their jobs correctly to the risk response measure not functioning as intended. If monitoring indicates a failure in compliance, then the response step of the risk management process is revisited. So if you fail your compliance test when you're monitoring, then you go back and revisit what happened. And again, it can happen because somebody didn't do their job, or that the risk response measure didn't function in the way that it was intended. So you go back. A key element of the feedback to the response step when a compliance failure happens is the finding from compliance monitoring indicating the reason for the compliance failure. In some instances, compliance failures can be fixed by simply re-implementing the same risk measures with little or no change. But in other instances, compliance failures are more complicated. The selected risk response measures are too difficult to implement, or the measures didn't function as expected. In such cases, it might be necessary for your organization to return to the evaluation and decision portions of the risk response step to develop some different risk response measures. Things don't always work. Task 4.1, um, risk monitoring strategy. We're still talking about the types of monitoring. Now we're talking about effectiveness monitoring. Risk response measured implemented correctly and operating as intended do not guarantee an effective reduction of risk. Let me say that again. You can have your risk response measures implemented correctly and operating as intended, but that does that the risk that you were trying to mitigate is actually reduced. This is primarily because of one, the complexity of operating environments, which may generate unintended consequences. Two, subsequent changes in levels of risk or associated risk factors. Threats, vulnerabilities, impact, or likelihood could have changed. Three, inappropriate or incomplete criteria established as an output of the risk response step. And four, changes in information systems and environments of operation after the risk response measures have been implemented. This is usually true when organizations try to determine if more strategic outcomes have been achieved and for more dynamic operating environments. Still talking about monitoring effectiveness. Example, if the desired outcome for an organization is to be less susceptible to advanced persistent threats. This may be challenging to measure since these types of threats are by definition very difficult to detect. Even when organizations are able to establish effectiveness criteria, it is often difficult to obtain criteria that are quantifiable. Therefore, it may become a matter of subjective judgment as to whether the implemented risk response measures are ultimately effective. Even if quantifiable effectiveness criteria are provided, it may be difficult to determine if the information provided satisfies the criteria. That'll keep you up at night. Effectiveness monitoring is employed by organizations to determine if implemented risk response measures have actually been effective in reducing identified risk to the desired level. Although effectiveness monitoring is different from compliance, failure to achieve desired levels of effectiveness may be an indication that risk response measures have been implemented incorrectly or are not operating as intended. Determining the effectiveness of risk response measures is generally more challenging than determining whether the measures have been implemented correctly and are operating as intended, um, meeting identified compliance requirements. If your organizations determine that risk response measures are not effective, then it may be necessary to return to the risk response step. Therefore, depending on the reason for the lack of effectiveness, you might revisit all portions of the risk response step, development, evaluation, decision, and implementation, and potentially the risk assessment step as well. These activities may result in your organization developing and implementing entirely new risk responses. And finally, let's look at change monitoring. So we've looked at compliance monitoring, effectiveness monitoring. Let's look at change monitoring. Organizations monitor changes to your information systems and the environments in which those systems operate. Monitoring changes to information systems and environments of operation is not linked directly to previous risk response measures, but it is nonetheless important to detect changes that may affect the risk to your organization's operations, assets, individuals, other organizations, and if you're federal, the nation, or if you're part of critical infrastructure. Generally, such monitoring detects changes in conditions that may undermine risk assumptions, and those assumptions are articulated in the risk framing step. So, monitoring changes as it relates to the information system. Changes can occur in organizational information systems that can be your hardware, software, or your firmware that can introduce new risk or that can change existing risk. An example one, a simple update to operating system software can eliminate security capabilities that existed in earlier versions, thereby introducing new vulnerabilities into your information systems. Another example is the discovery of new system vulnerabilities that fall outside of the scope of the tools and processes available to address such vulnerabilities. Monitoring changes in your environment of operations. The environments in which information systems operate can also change in ways that introduce new risk or change existing risks. And usually, when we're talking about changes to existing risk, we're looking at increases in existing risks. Environmental and operational considerations include, but are not limited to, business functions, threats, vulnerabilities, business processes, facilities, policies, legislation, and technologies. Um, One example is new legislation or regulations could be passed that impose additional requirements on organizations. Again, GDPR. This change might affect the risk assumptions established by organizations. Example two, a change in the threat environment that reports new tactics, techniques, and procedures, or increases in the technical capabilities of your adversaries. Changes in technology can also affect the underlying risk assumptions established by the organization. And unlike other types of change, Technology changes may be completely independent of the organization, but still affect the risk that the organizations must address. Um, Example, improvements in computing power may undermining what constitutes sufficiently strong means of authentication. For example, the number of authentication factors or cryptographic mechanisms. Again, monitoring changes in environments of operation, reductions in available resources, personnel, or funding, which in turn results in changing priority. Changes in the ownership of third party suppliers could affect supply chain risk. Mission changes may require that the organization revisit underlying risk assumptions. For example, an organization that collects threat information on possible domestic terrorist attacks and shares that information with federal law enforcement and intelligence agencies may have its scope changed so that the organization is responsible for also sharing some of the information with local first responders. Such change could affect assumptions regarding the security resources such users may have at their disposal. So when you're asked to do something different or to include another body of clients, then that's going to affect your resource allocation and your resource availability, which will increase your risk posture. So all things to consider when you're looking at the environment of operation. Now let's talk about again still talking about the risk monitoring strategy. Let's look at automated versus manual monitoring. So the risk monitoring task, even though there are only two activities, it's pretty comprehensive, a lot to think about. So automated versus manual monitoring. Organizations can conduct monitoring either by automated or manual methods, and there's a whole NIST publication on continuous monitoring, and I'll cover that at a later date. Where automated monitoring is possible, it should be employed because it's generally faster, more efficient, more cost effective than manual monitoring. Automated monitoring is also less prone to human error. However, not all monitoring can take advantage of automation. And that's going to be in your policies, in your processes, in your guidelines. Those are also security controls. And they can't be, you can't set the system up to monitor them, many of them automatically. Monitoring conducted at tier 3 generally lends itself to automation. So at your system level, um, automated monitoring activities can occur, where activities being monitored are information technology based. Such activities can usually be detected, tracked, and monitored through the installation of appropriate software, hardware, and/or firmware. To ensure that automated processes, procedures, and/or mechanisms supporting monitoring activities are providing the information needed, such processes, procedures, and mechanisms should be appropriately validated, updated, and monitored. This monitoring can be supported by automation when the risk mitigation measures being validated are IT based. For example, installation of firewalls or testing of configuration settings on desktop computers. Such automated validation can often check whether risk mitigation measures are installed and whether the installations are correct. Similarly, effectiveness monitoring can also be supported by automation. If the threshold conditions for determining the effectiveness of risk response measures are predetermined, then automation can support such effectiveness monitoring. While automation can be a supporting capability for tiers 1 and 2, generally automation does not provide substantive insights for non-IT based activities, which are more prevalent at those higher tiers 1 and 2. So automation pretty much is a tier 3 kind of thing, your system level. Tiers 1 and 2, not so much. Activities that are not as likely to benefit from automation will include, for example, the use of multiple suppliers within the supply chain, evolving environments of operation, or evaluating the promise of emerging technical capabilities in support of business functions. Where automated monitoring is not available, organizations employ manual monitoring and or analysis. So, still in task 1, your risk monitoring strategy, let's talk about the frequency of monitoring. Risk monitoring gives an increased level of situational awareness of the security state of the organization information systems and the environments of operation. This helps your organization develop a better understanding of risk. Monitoring can provide significant benefits, especially in situations where such monitoring limits the opportunities for adversaries to gain a foothold in your organization, either through your information systems or the environments in which those systems operate. Factors that are going to affect the frequency of risk monitoring include, but aren't limited to, organizational mission business functions. What are you doing? The ability to use the monitoring results to facilitate greater situational awareness, the anticipate changes in IT systems and operating environments, the potential impact of risk if not properly addressed, the degree to which the threat space is changing, and the type of monitoring conducted, automated versus procedural or manual. Um, to speak to the point about the threat space changing in healthcare and finance and the electrical system, that threat space is changing. Healthcare is changing rapidly because it's considered now a target, a riper target, and so you have more adversaries targeting their resources, and so they're having to be more diligent and more aggressive about monitoring their systems to make sure that they're not under attack. Depending on the frequency of monitoring required by organizations, in most situations, monitoring is most efficient and cost effective when automation is used. When manual monitoring is employed, it is generally not efficient to perform the monitoring with the same frequency that automation allows, and that's just common sense. Sometimes infrequent monitoring is sufficient though. Infrequent monitoring is not a major issue where changes happen more gradually and therefore don't lend themselves to frequent monitoring. And some examples include your mission business functions, your facilities, your legislation and regulatory requirements, your policies, and your technologies. These types of changes are better suited to condition event based monitoring to determine if the changes have any impact on risk. So, yes, you want to look at changes in your environment and changes in your functions and facilities and requirements, but those changes don't happen that frequently. And when they do, you do have to look to see how the change in posture. All right, that was task 4-1, your risk monitoring strategy, quite a bit. The next task is risk monitoring. Task 4-2, monitor organizational information systems and environments of operation on an ongoing basis to verify compliance, determine effectiveness of risk response measures, and identify changes. So again, you have compliance monitoring, monitoring, effectiveness monitoring, and change monitoring. Once organizations complete the development of their monitoring strategies, the strategies are implemented organization wide. Because there are so many diverse aspects of monitoring, not all aspects of monitoring may be performed or they may be performed at different times. The particular aspects of monitoring that are performed are dictated largely by the assumptions, constraints, risk tolerances, and priorities trade offs established by our organizations during the risk framing step. My words are starting to run together. I'm sorry. Hmm. Example, while organizations might want to conduct all forms of monitoring, compliance, effectiveness, and change, the constraints imposed upon the organizations may allow only compliance monitoring that can be readily automated at tier 3. If multiple aspects of monitoring can be supported, the output from the risk framing step helps organizations to determine the degree of emphasis and to place on the various monitoring activities. Here's the deal. You can't look at everything all the time. So what you have to do as an organization is look at your data, look at your information systems that you're protecting, figure out what your critical assets and systems are, and prioritize those accordingly. So you have to protect your most critical assets in the event of resource constraints. Okay, monitoring activities must be coordinated. Not all monitoring activities are conducted at the same tiers for the same purpose at the same time or using the same techniques. Let me say that again because that was a fun sentence to say. Not all monitoring activities are conducted at the same tiers for the same purpose at the same time or using the same techniques. It is important that organizations attempt to coordinate the various monitoring activities. Coordination of monitoring activities facilitates the sharing of risk related information that may be useful in providing early warning, developing trend information, or allocating risk response measures in a timely and efficient manner. If monitoring is not coordinated, the benefit of monitoring may be reduced and could undermine the overall effort to identify and address risk. As feasible, organizations implement the various monitoring activities in a manner that maximizes the overall goal of monitoring, looking beyond the limited goals of particular monitoring activities. Monitoring results are used in incremental risk assessments. Risk monitoring results are applied to performing increments to maintain awareness of the risk being incurred, to highlight changes to risk, and to indicate the need to revisit other steps in the risk management process as appropriate. So, anytime we're looking at our monitoring results and we see some kind of change or in the level of risk and the environment, whatever we're looking at, then we go back and perform an incremental risk assessment. All right. Those are your risk response. I mean, not your risk response, your risk monitoring activities. Now let's talk about outputs and post conditions. Risk monitoring outputs and post conditions. Thank you so much for hanging in there with me. We're almost done. The output from the risk monitoring step is the information generated by verifying that required risk response measures are implemented and that information security requirements derived from and traceable to your business functions, legislation, standards, guidelines are satisfied. Determining the ongoing effectiveness of risk response measures. And the final output, identifying changes to organizational information systems and environments of operation. So the output from the risk monitoring step is the information generated by verifying that risk response measures are implemented and that information security requirements are satisfied, determining the ongoing effectiveness of your risk response measures, and identifying changes within the information systems or within the environment of operation. Outputs from the risk monitoring step can be useful inputs to the risk framing step, assessment, and response steps as well. Compliance monitoring results may require that the organization revisit the implementation portion of the risk response step. Effectiveness monitoring results may require that the organization revisit the entire risk response step. Change monitoring may require that you revisit the risk assessment step. Risk monitoring results can also serve the risk framing step when the organization discovers new threats or vulnerabilities that affect your risk assumptions, your risk tolerance, and or your priorities and trade-offs. So it's iterative. And that, my dears, is the end of the risk monitoring step. That's step 4 in the risk management process according to NIST. Remember, frame, assess, respond, and monitor. Thank you again for joining me. I look forward to seeing you in another video and have a great day.